Hello, word nerds. Happy Sunday and welcome to our weekly live chat. This is going to be a super special, exciting discussion because it is kind of kicking off something we want to do more of throughout the year and maybe beyond. We want to start digging deeper into genres, what they are, why we love them, and how all of that kind of goes into writing our own books. So before we kind of dig into all of the details, we were going to go through and kick things off by sharing kind of one of our favorite genres or subgenres and something about them that makes us love them, and we can kind of go from there and see where the discussion goes. And because everyone was kind of not sure how to answer this, I will actually go first. And I'm going to go with urban fantasy for mine because it is the genre that I most steadily love things in. And I am just a big fan of kick-ass heroines in urban fantasy. So Desiree, you are next.
Oh, joy. Okay. I'm going to say high fantasy since Kelly said we weren't allowed to say just regular fantasy. So high fantasy. Also, another thing I was thinking of, but I didn't know if it counted as a genre or anything, but anything with like ensemble casts, it literally doesn't matter the genre. I love ensemble casts so much.
Mm-hmm. And Emma?
I'm going to go even more specific than high fantasy. This is within high fantasy. I really, really love like court intrigue fantasy. Like anytime there's like different people like scheming and there's like secrets and like as the reader, you think you have everything figured out, but then you don't. Like, I love that sort of thing where like everybody's got like their own like motives and their own schemes and their own secrets. And you have like people like backstabbing each other. Love it. Within like a fantasy world in particular.
Yeah. So. And Rachel?
Ooh, I would go okay, high fantasy, I think. Just like I was gonna say urban fantasy because I was thinking some of my favorite series are like that, and like kind of like the idea that like fantasy isn't that far away from our own world. But then looking at my bookshelf, it is majority high fantasy, so I prefer a world that is completely not like ours, and usually some kind of like adventure perusal for that.
And Megan?
This is a very good question. And I'm not sure if this is like my all-time favorite subgenre, but this is one that I've been enjoying a lot lately. Like the apocalyptic, just the world is ending and now we have to survive. And my favorite tropes in those are like the ragtag group of humans, and maybe not humans, who knows, who have to like band together to survive this apocalypse. I'm a sucker for it every time.
Yeah, I've always loved like post-apocalyptic stuff, but like starting right at the end of the world and like surviving and rebuilding civilization and probably killing things.
Probably.
So when you guys think of genre, like what exactly, not how would you define it? Because to me, it's kind of what you find in a bookstore of like, these are all the fantasy books and these are the sci-fi books and the romance books. So when you're thinking about genre, are you thinking about it in those big picture things, or are we looking at it more in terms of, oh, one sec. All right, my screen just went away. Someone jump in and talk about something.
I think of like a genre. I think of a genre as like a collection of books that have like certain similar elements. So like in fantasy, you're going to have some sort of fantastical element, whether it's like magic or like fantasy creatures or just like something not like something that like couldn't exist in our real world, most likely. Where like sci-fi, you'd have some sort of like technology element or something like advanced. So
right. Good way of thinking about it. Yeah. Well, even Kelly kind of mentioned this before our chat when we were talking about like, oh, what's your favorite subgenre? And to me, well, I guess you mentioned like, oh, dystopian is a subgenre of sci-fi, but to me, like dystopian is a whole genre to itself. So I guess I don't understand what genre is.
Well, that's kind of
they're like new things.
Like anything kind of magical is fantasy. Anything kind of technology is sci-fi. But people think more about what like your favorite genre is more likely to actually be a subgenre because genres are helping readers find that specific thing that they want.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I actually like do a lot of talking about genre with like future English teacher college students, and that's like something we talk about is that there's like your really big umbrella genres, which a lot of times is what you're gonna find in like bookstores or something, you know. So you'll have like fantasy, sci-fi, like suspense,
Fiction,
contemporary,
mystery.
yeah. So there's like the big umbrellas, and then underneath that, there's going to be a lot of like more specific things.
Yeah. In the self-publishing world, when you're trying to pick your genres, because in Amazon they're letting you pick categories, which are a lot of like super subgenres. So it's kind of like genre, subgenre, and then you can even, when you're trying to find readers, you're really targeting tropes in a lot of cases of like broader tropes, more or less, but like sweet romance, friends to lovers kind of thing. There are people who only read that, or
it's like cozy mystery.
Yeah, exactly.
People those. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't really understand what that is, but I've heard of it a lot.
Like a lot of the big readers on Amazon are only reading a very specific niche inside a subgenre of like that is like a lot of people when mainstream publishing stopped publishing vampire novels, there were so many readers who still just wanted to read all vampires all the time. So that's why it still did fine in self-publishing, because there were readers who just wanted that. Yeah. It's not necessarily a broad enough base for a big bestseller hit, but they're out there.
Yeah. That's like I know people like that who only read like one type of book and that's it. And it's like so hard for me to like imagine. Cause like if I read like I love fantasy, but if I read too many fantasy books in a row, I get super burnt out and I'm like, I've got to read something else. Like I need like some like fluffy contemporary. Like I have to mix it up and do different things.
It's like a palate cleanser or something.
Especially when you get really specific and you're like, I only read like vampire books. I'm like, how can you not get like tired of like the same type
or
of
like
book?
Regency era vampire books?
Even more hardcore on the like
Regency vampire romance vampire books.
Oh, that's totally a thing. Like I know not personally, but an author who like she has two pen names. One is clean cowboy romances, and one is sweet beach romances, and that is all she writes. Each pen name publishes a specific thing, and her readers will just keep reading that thing forever. So it works well, but I can't imagine doing that as a writer.
Yeah, I can't imagine as a writer or a reader, just like one thing.
Yeah. Well, to be like, if I see, you know, for like, you know, I don't know, like romance books or something, you know, with beautiful women on the front cover in a pretty dress and like a shirtless guy, and oh my god, he's so handsome, whatever, and they're like all about like court stuff, or you know the prince's whatever, or the duke, the heirloom, or
duke or something.
Exactly.
So many
if you see, but if I see, so like I work at a bookstore, and like if I'm putting stuff away and I see this one author's written like 30 books and they're all pretty much the same thing, I'm like, don't you get bored of that? I don't know if it's like, oh, and again, this goes into the whole like if you have, you know, a rhythm and you have a set of things that you do every single time and it sells, you just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, like wouldn't readers get bored? Wouldn't you get bored? But then it sells well, so it's like, it's like this weird.
As a writer of that genre, though, like you love it so much that I don't think you do get bored. Like, I think it's probably a really fun challenge finding ways to put semi-fresh spins on the same tropes. Like, I'm sure that there is an inherently rewarding challenge to that, and finding ways to surprise your readers when they've read 30 books by you that are the same genre.
Yeah, for sure. Like I don't read like a ton of romance, but I read some of it. And like the authors I like are the ones that find ways to like, you know, they're following that like romance has a very, and we'll have like a whole chat on romance, I guess, but romance is like very much in a lot of ways has like a formula to like the plot points, but like those authors who can find like ways to still surprise you and have like cool twists on things, or even just like little like emotional things or personality things with characters, like finding unique ways to do that, like always really impresses me. And I think the best authors could do that, so that like it keeps readers wanting to read their stuff.
For sure.
And there's also something to be said, like, for reader expectations, that, like, especially with, like, things like mystery or romance, the people who read those things, like, they expect certain things from those books. So, like, and they're looking for certain things, and that's what they want out of books, and, like, that's totally cool. Like, I want to read lots of different things, but some people, like, they want to read, like, a happy ending between, like, two people falling in love, and, like, that's what they want out of their reading experience. So the fact that writers can do that consistently for them.
I'm wondering if it's a little different coming from the world of YA. Of like YA readers are a little more accustomed to reading different genres, where in like the broader adult fiction, it's a little more specific. Like YA isn't a genre, it's an age category, but it's also like a state of mind kind of.
Yeah.
The publishing industry is different in YA.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking even now, like, so for example, I suppose, I'm right in the middle of reading King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo, who has done the Shadow and Bone series, and she did the Six of Crows duology, like in that same world. And for me, reading that, first, like, it's good. I like it. Love that world. Love the characters. It's good. But I'm also like, I want something else from her, because I'm like, okay, like we've spent enough time in this world, or like with this writing style. Like, I think it would be cool if she's like, I'm gonna write a sci-fi novel. Like, I'd be so much more interested, because I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, it's something that's, you know, like she doesn't typically write. So I'm thinking if there is a, you know, if there's like a romance writer that was like, I'm gonna write a sci-fi, and you're like, okay, like, would people be down with that, or would people be like, no, like, stay in your lane?
Nora Roberts comes to mind. Doesn't she have like a?
Oh yeah, she does mystery stuff.
Yeah, she was like super huge, so she had room to experiment. Like, maybe you have to be that like
Some people
top tier.
Some people, if they want to do multiple things, they'll do different pen names.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, I think it depends on how big. Like, Nora Roberts could definitely do it because she's bigger.
Yeah.
Have you guys been following
JD Robb, I think, is her. Yeah, JD Robb is her other one. Yeah.
Mystery, I think, for mystery.
Yeah, mystery novels. Yeah.
Have you guys been following Adam Silvera on Instagram at all?
No.
He's been talking about, he's got a fantasy novel coming out. I'm so excited for it. It's called Infinity Sun.
Oh my gosh. We'll see, like, that's what I'm talking about. Because he's only written kind of like sort of sciencey contemporaries. And so now that he's doing something completely different, I'm like, yes, I'm here for it. Like, I want to see what else he can do. So like, I'm excited about that.
It's also dangerous sometimes though, because sometimes like the author isn't good. Like, there are other stuff like
there isn't good.
Like, as much as I love Rainbow Rowell, like, I don't like Carry On very much, and I like her contemporary better than her fantasy, you know.
But some people love it. Like, it's
I'm personally offended by that statement.
That's where it just X's out.
I really like the romance in Carry On, which really cemented for me that she's a great contemporary writer. I didn't care for the fantasy elements.
I can understand that. I personally love Carry On, but I do think there might be some bleed over from my love of Fangirl that's kind of clouding my.
There's a little cross contamination.
Wait, bit. You like Fangirl?
I know, right?
That doesn't sound like you.
I know.
But I also like, speaking of like authors who kind of like write in the same like genre or even the same world, like, I'm actually like really impressed by Cassandra Clare, because she's like been writing in the same world this whole time, but she's one of those authors that's like found ways to make it like surprising still, and to make it like fresh every time. Like, I was kind of like, originally I wasn't going to read the Lady Midnight series because I was like, oh, it's just going to be like, I thought Mortal Instruments went on for too long, and so like, I thought it was going to be more of that. But then I finally read it because everyone was raving about it so much, and like, it's really, really good. And I like that she like has found different ways to tell the story. Like, with each of her series, she's been telling it from a different perspective. So like with Lady Midnight, like, she's not telling it from the perspective of like a girl who finds out she has powers. Like, it's someone who's been like raised that way her whole life, and I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I love Lady Midnight. That's like her best writing.
So good. And it's like, I'll definitely read if she like one day when she like branches out and like writes stuff in other worlds. But like, if she wanted to just keep writing the Shadowhunters world forever, I'd still keep reading them, because like
it would just become its own subgenre.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, like, that's the thing, because she's writing and like 2 more series, and then like also like a bunch of companion novellas. So she's writing a lot in the same world. And part of me is like, yes, I'm down for it. I'm here for it. Like, I'm invested in this world. I think it's really cool. But then also I'm like, when are you going to do anything else, you know? And she kind of does. Someone pointed out that she has the middle grade series with Holly Black, the Magisterium. So she has that. So like, technically she has.
I know she said that like, so she has like those next 2 series, like the one that's like a sequel to the Infernal Devices, kind of like about their children.
Chain of Gold.
It's about like testing children. Yeah. And then the other series is about Julian's brother. And I think she said no, the little brother.
Ty?
One with autism, yeah.
Really?
I'm pretty sure.
Oh my god, yes.
Pretty sure.
I love Ty.
They've really been like building up his story in like the other series, so I think it's about him. But I think she said after those 2 trilogies, she like plans on moving on. I think she said she wanted to do like 5 series. It's 5, right? Yeah, 5.
Well, see, like, that's, oh my god, that's, wow. Okay. But like, that is like a whole subgenre by itself, because she's kind of like ended the world, you know, like multiple times. Like, how do you go on from here, honestly? It's just like, okay, but everything's been solved. All right.
She does it, you know, like
She does, and it's great, and I love them.
One of the things that I loved about the Shadowhunter series, I first picked it up in high school, which was a long time ago now. And it was one of the first books that I had read that was urban fantasy that wasn't so heavily categorized. Like it had vampires and werewolves and angels and and just like everything. And that kind of mashup, like it blew my mind as a 16-year-old or whatever. I was like, you can do anything.
I love like genre mashups, like historical fantasy and like
I love historical fantasy.
Yeah, and like mysteries that also have like fantasy mysteries, like all of that. Like, if you can, like I love like Dread Nation, how it's like history and also like zombies, which is like kind of a sci-fi subgenre. Like stuff like that is really cool.
I wonder if that's another thing that's more prevalent in YA though.
It
It's
is.
like you wander the mystery shelves in a bookstore and you're not seeing fantasy mysteries.
No, you're not.
Yeah.
And especially like with like the work I do with like YA and future teachers, like it can be really difficult sometimes, like when I'm creating resources for them and I'm trying to like put books into like subgenres and I'm like, well, this book kind of fits in like 3 different subgenres, which like, is not as common in adult fiction.
Yeah.
So I guess when you're writing a book that has multiple possible genres, like how do you decide how to pitch it, whether it's to your readers because you're indie pubbing or to an agent? Like how do you pick which genre to target?
I think I'd talk about the one that is like the most important or that has the most sway in the story. Actually, I'm like, I just watched a thing the other day from Francina Simone, who's an amazing booktuber. And she did a video on like, is romance ruining books kind of thing.
I've been meaning to watch that.
It's really good.
About that.
Yeah, she's a great YouTuber. I love her a lot. But her video was kind of about how books are pitched as like fantasy novels or historical novels or whatever, but the romance of it is not like a subplot. Like it's enough that it should be called a romance book. So she kind of like goes into like what constitutes like as a romance, or like what, you know, this is what a fantastical romance is, what a romance fantasy is, and like what a, you know, like a fantasy with romance is. Like there's like some difference in there. So you have to really think about it as like, what's the main thing about your book? Is it about 2 people, you know, falling in love also with magic? Or is it, I found out I have magic and there's a big war coming and there's also this cute guy that's here for like a couple pages? Like you have to kind of figure out what is like the main point of your book.
Well, that's one thing I'm liking in self-publishing and Amazon. I don't know how true it is in traditional publishing, but in the fantasy genres that I like, urban fantasy, you have a city in modern times and magic, and maybe a love interest, but it's not the main focus, versus paranormal, which is all the same thing, but the romance is front and center. So it's very easy to see like exactly what you're getting, and very easy to target those readers as well.
I was just thinking that like that paranormal like genre, like subgenre, has a like really heavy like romance focus in most of the paranormal books I've read.
Yeah. A lot of times they're called paranormal romances.
Yeah.
It's like such a strong element that you really have to talk about both. And yeah, I think like kind of like what Rachel was saying, you really have to think about like what's the strongest and most important element to the story, and like, and kind of going off what Kelly was saying too, like what's going to, which group of readers are you appealing to the most? You know, like is the audience of like romance readers, are they the type of people who would be likely to pick up your book, or is it fantasy readers who are likely to pick up your book?
Yeah, that's the thing that she was kind of mentioning, and that I definitely understand is A Court of Thorns and Roses, Sarah J. Maas, was pitched as a fantasy novel, but it's actually a romance novel because the romance takes up the most page time, and it's kind of like what's driving the main character. So it's a romance fantasy instead of a fantasy with romance. Like
it was also pitched as a YA when it's really an adult.
Oh my goodness,
different issue.
I did a video on this channel and my own channel about new adult and YA. You guys should go watch it.
Yes, everyone should.
Featuring A Court of Thorns and Roses. Oh my lord, that is not YA. Anyways, yeah, exactly.
So is there such thing as too many genres? Can your book have too many?
Not if you're self-publishing, I don't think, in my opinion.
I think you can pitch it with too many.
Yeah.
I I mean, I think you probably could if you tried to like do elements of like every single like genre or something. Like it could get to be because if your book just has too much happening and like too much in it,
Yeah.
like that could be an issue. Where readers are like, I don't know. This goes back to reader expectations, and readers are like, I don't know what kind of book I'm reading. Like that can be like really confusing and jarring.
And like technically you can self-publish whatever you want, but if you want to find readers,
Right.
like you need to be looking at what kind of reader would enjoy this book. And if you can't figure that out because there's just too many factors, some of which some readers will hate and some readers will love and other things, and like you can do it, but you want to be looking at what's going to sell. Actually, that brings up something that gets brought up a lot in the indie world in terms of actually marketing your books and finding readers and all of that, is writing to market. In traditional publishing, they tell you so much, like don't try to follow trends and whatever, whereas in self-publishing, there's a lot more flexibility to do that. So when you are writing your book and trying to figure out how to market it, there's a lot of discussion on how to figure out who that reader is and exactly what that market is looking for. And you're not writing like plot point A, plot point B, plot point C, but you're looking at what are the most important tropes that these readers are looking for? How do you find them? How do you work them into your story? And then how do you tell those readers that this is what they're looking for? So
I think that's like a good point, even for traditional, like don't write to trends, but like do consider your market, because like trends will change, but like your market is still for the most part going to be like the same types of people. Like what do readers in like your genre expect from like those, you know, like romance, you better have a happily ever after. Like it's not a romance if it doesn't have a happily ever after, you know?
Yeah.
Or if you like write a fantasy and like there's not really any magic or so, like, you know, like there's definitely things people are going to expect from your book.
I feel like a lot of times in the traditional publishing world, we talk about like, oh, well, different things sell better at different times, which is true. Like sometimes just the general public, the people who are picking up new books are more likely to pick up this random dystopian that happened to get big or whatever. But you can't really sell a book based on the people who aren't reading consistently, because maybe they'll just pick up the Hunger Games and that's it. What you need to be looking for are the loyal readers and the ones who are looking for things consistently. And those are the ones who more often than not are looking for specific genres. And, you know, there are going to be books that trend well in each genre, but like those readers are always going to be there and they're always going to be looking for those specific things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely.
So as a writer, how do you figure out what are the most important factors or tropes to be putting in order to make your story resonate with people who love that genre?
I think the biggest thing for me is that like I'm writing in certain genres because they're what I love to read. So like I'm always thinking first about like what it is. Like for most books, I think for like every book I write, like I will like make like a list like in my notebook or something of like elements that like I really love in these types of stories and that I'd like to incorporate. Because if I like it, there's like a good chance that like other fantasy readers like these things too.
For sure. Yeah, and it doesn't mean like copy and paste it. It's not like, oh, I love that scene in the movie Leap Year or whatever. So, which I do, but I can't just like copy and paste it into my book and expect people who also like Leap Year to love that scene in my book. But knowing the things that make me feel giddy when I read them, and then figuring out how can I increase the joy that I feel in that scene with my own characters. Like what twist can I put on it that'll make me even more excited than I felt when I read this book?
Yeah, like definitely think about it in like more broad trope terms than just like, I like this specific scene, but like what about it is it that you like? Like, do you like when like there's a misunderstanding between two characters, or do you like when like, you know, there's like all the tropes of like they go to a hotel and there's only one room with one bed, you know? Or like, do you like banter between characters? Like those sorts of things are what I write down. Like I want to include like a lot of banter and like, I can't think of anything else right now. Banter.
Banter, enemies banter to lovers, missed connections. That's another one of my favorite ones. Whether like romantic or like evil things happening.
And I think breaking it down to those levels can be so important, but like it's surprising the amount of people who will try to write a story without really appreciating the genre or or reading it. Like you do occasionally see the question of, oh, I wrote this romance story, but they don't get together at the end. Is that okay? And it's just no. Or the people who only read Harry Potter and Twilight and think they can write YA and that kind of thing of like, you're just not reading enough, but you think you have this great idea, but don't understand everything that's gone into building up the genre ahead of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any genre you're going to be writing in, you have to be reading extensively.
Mm-hmm.
And like current, like you need to be reading new stuff. You need to be reading like the classics in your genre, like all of that.
For sure.
And it needs to be something you enjoy. Like if you're like, this is all dumb and I'm gonna do it right, like that's not not gonna work.
No,
your readers will not
be able to
appreciate
tell
that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we'll talk more in depth. So it's like every other month or something, we're going to be doing one of these chats, and we'll talk in each one. So like when we do the paranormal one, we'll talk about some of like the up and coming paranormals, the classics. So if you're like, but I want to write in this genre, but I don't even know where to start, we will have you covered there.
Yes, I'm excited for all these. So.
Me too.
Yeah, there's so much to dig into. Like you don't even think about all the different pieces that build up an entire genre.
Mm-hmm.
Like it seems so easy to be like, yeah, this has magic or this has science or zombies or whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit, Kelly, about like targeting audiences using genre. Could you talk a little bit more about how you've done that lately, like with your books that you've put out?
A lot of it is cover design of like making sure your cover says what genre you're in, like, and going specifically into subgenres or even like tropes of a book will have a vampire and a girl with a stake, and you can tell it's a certain kind of story. Like a lot of it is that, and a lot of what I've been doing this week actually is more in the advertising side of it. I've been doing Facebook ads and Amazon ads. So you're looking at keywords of people who like this will like your story.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much in the writing of the story anymore, where my head is anyway, of it's now how do I find those readers and hope they will connect with my book. So it's been interesting, but it's really convoluted to get into.
That's awesome. I was just curious.
Yeah. Like this afternoon, I actually spent a solid 2 hours trying to make 1,000 keywords for an Amazon ad and going through different genres and so writing down the names of books by top authors and the authors' names, and then author's name plus series and author's name plus name of a book. And so anytime someone's entering that into Amazon, you're trying to put your book in front of them and hope there's a connection there, and then kind of figure out which ones actually convert into sales.
That's so cool. Do you ever wonder if like someone has put your name in for that?
Apparently they have. When I was in Vegas and doing an event thing, someone said my name sounded really familiar. She's like, oh, I think I just targeted you for ads. I'm like, that is really cool.
Oh my God.
So.
That's so cool.
On a lighter topic, is there any genre or subgenre that you guys haven't read that much of but are interested in exploring more of?
Ooh, magic realism.
I don't think I've ever fully understand what that is.
It's very difficult to explain.
Yeah, it's super, which is why. So for a really long time, I thought I hated magic realism. But just recently, I've read a couple of really good ones, which actually started off with Raven Boys. Yeah, I'm not even sure
that I would put Raven Boys as magical realism. Honestly,
what would you put it as then?
I don't know, but I don't think I do magical realism.
Well, because it's okay. So like again, this goes like magic realism is actually the thing that it's like, what do you put it under? Do you put it under contemporary? Do you put it under fantasy? Do you put it under like paranormal stuff? Because as far as I'm like thinking of it as, magic realism is real world stuff where there is a fantastical element that is recognized as normal. So.
See, I don't think it's recognized as normal by most people in their world in Raven Boys. It's just them.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
I don't know. I definitely think magical realism is one of those things that like you know it when you see it kind of thing. But also like part of my issue with saying Raven Boys is because I'm like very hesitant to call something magical realism if the author like isn't like Latinx or like African diaspora or something.
Okay.
If it's a white author, I have a really because like Summer of Salt I would say is like pretty close to magical realism, but I'm like hesitant to actually call it that.
Because it does have such cultural ties, and it's like so important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And like I actually saw someone recently saying that like a good way to put it for books like Summer of Salt is to say like it's a light fantasy novel with like elements of or like inspired by magical realism or something like
Okay.
that. Actually,
That's
Like
really
the-
good to know.
So it'd be like light fantasy would be okay. All right. Just change the way I think about that, because like if I'm thinking even now, like I'd say Maggie Stiefvater is like the person that writes that the most that I could think of. So like Scorpio races is there are Kelpies, which are like magical death horses that come from the sea, and like everyone in this town is like, yep, that exists. Like that, it's just a normal part of November. Like that's just what happens. But the rest of us, that would be magic, and that would be weird. So that's like magic realism, because that is something that's accepted by them. Or Summer of Salt is, it's this bird that comes back every year, and it's been coming back for hundreds of years, and we know that it's our family are witches, but like the rest of the island never calls us witches, but they know we can do stuff. Like that's kind of like magic realism to me, because that is what everyone's accepted, but it's not like regular or real. So I guess like light fantasy is that. I've never read anything else that I would consider light fantasy, so I guess I
Maggie Stiefvater's books in general are hard to categorize. I feel like sure, it's a very specific kind of fantasy that's like hard to. But yeah, like there's not a lot of magical realism in YA. Like it's not very common. Like really, I just think of like Anne Marie McLemore, and I'm like, she's most of YA magical realism.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking also with other books like Stations 11 by Emily St. John Mandel and The Book of M by Peg Shepard. Like those ones are really good, and I would consider those magic realism. But also, I guess now that I think about it, it would be light fantasy, because they're super weird,
post-apocalyptic almost.
Yeah, but they're like post-apocalyptic magic, but also in a real world setting, sort of. Like they're very strange and they're hard to pin down. So to me, that would be magic realism, because they're not really anything, but there's still like magic in it. So I guess they would be a light fantasy.
I think light fantasy is the easiest like way to wrap my head around what it is we're talking about.
But light fantasy is not an industry approved term, so don't start querying your books with light fantasy.
Well, because I'm trying to think
it fantasy.
What would I count as light fantasy, like in a fantasy novel? I'm like, you can't. It's a fantasy novel or it's a super high fantasy novel. There's no like slightly fantasy novel, because then you compare that into paranormal or urban fantasy or whatever.
That is one of the benefits of querying when you're going the traditional route, is that if you do have written a book that you feel is a little weird and you're not totally sure where it belongs, you can pick the genre that you think is the most correct. Like, I think this one is probably a fantasy. They would probably market it as a fantasy. And your agent from there can help you. Like they might think, actually, let's try and market it more as paranormal. And even beyond that, like if it sells, then the editor can be like, well, we're going to stick it with these titles, which are this genre.
Yeah. I also feel like a lot of magical realism tends to be pretty literary. Like,
yeah, it does.
So
yeah, well, the books I just mentioned, like those are not regular YA books. Like those are other. Oh, actually, sorry, I'm like looking at them on my shelf, which is right next to We Were Liars, which is like, what do you?
Which is like paranormal, but you don't know you're reading paranormal.
So yeah, because like I called that one somewhat magic realism.
That book is so good.
But it's also
I need to
like,
reread it.
paranormal. It's not really paranormal though. Like how do you explain it? Like it's
that book under suspense, because like
that is the genre. Like that you're.
It has magical elements, but like it's a suspense.
And you can get away with magical elements in the suspense genre. Like that is a genre that allows for that wiggle room.
That is
I'm so excited about this.
It's so weird. But like that's the fun part, which kind of goes back to like, can you genre mash? Like I like books that are like you can't quite pin them down. And books that have too many genres, sometimes that is a good thing, and sometimes it's to your detriment.
But I do feel like it's harder for me to take a chance on those books unless I hear a bunch of people raving about them.
For sure.
Right? Like if I'm not really sure what I'm getting into, I'm never quite in the mood for whatever this thing is.
Yeah.
It's not a mood that I have.
Raven Voice took me years to get around to reading. I was like, I don't know. I don't really understand.
Seems weird.
Yeah, me too. I didn't.
Someone like
described
described Station 11. Someone described Station 11 to me and they were like, oh, well, it's like post-apocalyptic and there's Shakespeare and like these people, they're kind of like building a museum sort of. And I was like, okay.
I know, to be fair, that's a book that's really hard to explain.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it's so good and it's so beautiful.
It is really good.
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking, so The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon is one of my favorite series ever. And it's so hard to pitch because as someone like, bookstore, it's my staff pick. And everyone's like, oh, like, it's your staff pick. Like, tell us about it. And I'm like, I can't. You're not going to want to buy it.
Kind of sci-fi.
It's like paranormal, futuristic,
Alternate
sci-fi.
world.
But like,
It like
also
feels
alternate,
kind
but,
of like urban fantasy, but like not urban fantasy. Like it has like
Yeah.
a feel of urban fantasy, but with
Alternate world urban fantasy, maybe?
Yeah.
alternative world, futuristic, sci-fi, paranormal, urban fantasy. Like, yeah. But it's so good.
I feel like with that one, the world is the thing that's hard to pin down. Like the book itself, I think we could pull it apart and look at its tropes and be like, yeah, this is a fantasy. But it's the world that is like, wait, what's going on here?
Yeah, actually, you're right. If it wasn't for the world, then
the
it probably
world
would be a
is
fantasy.
kind of the Tierling, where you're like sort of fantasy, but also
What is
happening?
just what is happening? I don't understand.
Well, even like Game of Thrones in the early seasons when you don't really have a lot of magic, you're like, is this a fantasy or is it just...
Is it historical?
Yeah.
Like,
Like it's so clearly fantasy once you know that there's dragons, but...
And White Walkers. The White Walkers are here too. Yeah. Yeah, and like that like goes back to like sometimes like high fantasy like really just kind of means it's in a secondary world, like you could write something like fully in a secondary world even if Game of Thrones had never had dragons.
Well, yeah, and like the White Walkers though are like they're zombies basically. So is this sci-fi?
Yeah, and I think that like that isn't so much genre confusion as it is like putting in genre bending elements. It's like this is obviously a fantasy. But we're gonna put you kind of like zombies. Who doesn't want to dabble in zombies? So let's just bring these guys.
Ice zombies.
Yeah. And like adding the ice element makes it very fantasy feeling.
Well, even just giving them a leader with a purpose gives it more of a fantasy feeling. If you have a zombie king, he's a necromancer kind of thing. But if you just have zombies, it's
more necromancy than it's not a virus. It's like something that's been done with.
Yeah. True.
But, like sci-fi zombies are a virus.
Oh, and I love when
zombies are one that you could really see across like fantasy, sci-fi, apocalyptic. Like they're all just kind of
And the contemporary is super easy because it's like, would it happen in real life? Yes, it's a contemporary. You were saying at the beginning of this chat, like, oh, we should all say our favorite genres, and then like everyone's just going to be fantasy. So we need to somewhat, pare it down and talk about that. So there will be a contemporary chat at some point in this genre series. But.
I do love contemporary novels.
Yeah, I really do love jumping between genres. Like it's,
I
couldn't see myself just reading fantasy, even through the entire spectrum of fantasy, which is huge.
Yeah, I feel like mystery is the only genre I don't really read much of. Especially like adult mystery. Like I'll occasionally read like a YA like mystery or like I'll read thrillers, like YA thrillers, or like the occasional YA mystery. But like the mystery genre that there's like whole shelves to in the bookstore. Like I don't
well, when you mentioned cozy mystery earlier, there's a lot going on there in terms of genre mashup. Like there's one I've got on my Kindle called The Vampire Knitting Club. So and there is a lot of witches mashed up with cozy mystery. Like there's a whole fantasy thing within cozy mystery, but you don't really see that at all outside of cozies.
Interesting.
I would read cozy mysteries. That sounds amazing.
That is like one of the biggest cozy subgenres.
That's
like,
kind
they're
of cool.
everywhere. Yeah, it's just like witches solving murder mysteries, but like with their plucky gang of friends and not a lot of violence.
We need to come up with like a TBR for books that we're going to reference in the future chat.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I want to read like all of these in preparation.
That's cool because I feel like kind of like traditional like adult mystery genre has like never appealed to me. Like all the like I don't even know James Patterson as he does mystery. I don't know.
I think
But
he's
there's-
more
He does
Yeah, he's
thriller.
thrillers. But yeah, all those like detective mysteries that I feel like kind of all have like the same formula. I've just never been interested in them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But, like something
Yeah.
with witches, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like there's a
Solving
lot of
mysteries.
different things within cozy, like crafting is a big one. So you see a lot of the knitting stuff, and there's tons with like people who run bookstores and like
Christmas
there's
settings.
always like a
There are Christmas
yeah,
settings.
there's always like a cute niche and then a murder. Like that's just kind of what it is. I haven't read many, if any, but I really want to read more of them because it just sounds like fun.
Mhm.
That's all for my questions. If anyone has anything else we want to
One of the things that I was
cover.
gonna say is that like I feel like I'm the complete opposite of you guys, because if someone said like you can't read anything other than fantasy for the rest of your life,
But then you can't read Fangirl.
see, and I would be okay with that, like because
Okay.
fangirl's like one contemporary I like. So like if it was like a decision between you can never read anything fantasy or you can only read fantasy, there is so much fantasy. And
Oh,
there's
yeah,
so
I'd be
many
okay with that.
subgenres of fantasy. I could just read like I always said like real life is boring, add dragons. Like as much as I love fangirl, imagine Kath riding a dragon. Like
Hell yeah.
so
Oh my god, she'd be so happy and anxious all at once.
Exactly.
it'd be great.
Yeah. Well, I'm
So-
looking at my shelf now, and I have like one shelf that's like this big that has contemporary on it. The majority of those I have received as like advanced copies, so like I haven't even bought them. And then the rest of it is just pure fantasy novels. And then like one shelf of sci-fi, and that's it. So like I'd be okay with that.
I feel like I used to be like I almost exclusively read like fantasy. Like I didn't read much else, but like in the past like maybe like 3 years, I've really had to like branch out because like I definitely like started having a lot of burnout with fantasy and just like there I don't know, something about the last like few years, a lot of the fantasy books I have read I haven't like totally loved. So I've like kind of had to like read some other things too.
Yeah,
Right,
the last couple years have been like the years of mediocre fantasy novels. I think I said that about 2017
With a
was
few
like the year.
exceptions, but yeah.
With a few exceptions, it was like the year of mediocre fantasy novels. Like 2018, I think was like pretty good, but like 2019 already is like killing the game. So
Mhm.
I'm like, my January wrap up is coming out soon. Just saying, there's some great books in
Yeah.
there. So
I am so excited. We've got a lot of books that I feel like are going to be that weird. Like, what is this urban fantasy? Is this paranormal? Like, straddling that line, like The Devouring Grey
oh,
is coming out April 2nd. And is Wicked Saints a full-on fantasy? I think that one's a
think
full-on
so.
fantasy.
that also comes out April 2nd.
But it also comes out, yeah, we're all
Ah,
gonna be dead
I
the
want it
month
so
of
bad.
April.
I want it so bad.
Yeah, it's like a fairy tale.
Yeah. What else is? I feel like we're seeing a lot of witches coming back, and that, at least in the YA category, for sure. I'm not
very
as
excited about that.
attuned to the adult fluctuations or whatever. But yeah, we're seeing
Nadia
a
has
lot
a
of witches selling.
Yeah, I can't wait to
Yes.
read that. But
And there's
see,
that
that's
whole
another thing
anthology of vampires coming out.
where- Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I just-
Like
I remember,
Nikki
like-
Schwab on it.
Yeah, like vampires, of course, were like, oh, it's a dead trend, haha. Pun not intended. But then like now it's coming back, and I'm like, I'm here for it. Like, I'm okay. I'm ready for this. Like, I'm ready.
I
I
want
need
more,
vampires back. Like,
Mhm.
yeah,
oh,
more vampire books like The Coldest Girl in Cold Town. Like I love
Yeah,
that
I
one.
love that book so much.
That's another
No, I don't.
kind of like fantasy, kind of sci-fi because it's like in the future. It's like our world in the future.
Yeah,
With
but
vampires.
I would say it's like, yeah, it's like sci-fi vampires. It's like sci-fi
Yeah.
dystopian vampires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recently got an idea for a vampire urban fantasy book,
Yes.
and I have no time to write. Like, let me go finish what I'm working on, which I got to do first. But it's like, it's so like in my head, like it's dying to be written because it's about a vampire med student, and like,
Yes, I love it.
like, I need it in my life.
That sounds
I
great.
need vampires to come back.
That sounds great. Like you just, work at a blood bank. You don't have to sleep, so you could pull the night shifts. You probably could smell if there was something wrong with somebody. Like, great idea.
Oh my gosh.
I need to see a lot of that in terms of like publishing houses trying to guess what those next big genre trends are going to be, which honestly I'm not even sure is possible. Like it really is. There's going to be one book that like takes over the world, and then that is the genre trend. Like it's. I don't think there's ever going to be like everyone wants to read which books right now. Like that's.
Yeah. I think the closest it came to that was probably like the Divergent and like Hunger Games thing.
But it was Hunger Games. Like
it was Hunger Games.
Yeah.
There was a lot of dystopian. There was a lot of dystopian around that time.
Yeah, dystopian was like huge.
I like to hope that maybe publishing learned its lesson, like YA publishing learned its lessons from like vampires and dystopian, that like those two like subgenres, they like flooded when it got popular, and then everything that came out was like unsuccessful because they had too much stuff. I feel like they've been a lot more balanced since then, and like published a variety.
I miss having not with the genre, but the specific book that like everyone's reading and talking about. It's so long.
I just don't want all one genre, but I want that big book. Yeah.
Well, I think last year it was Children of Blood and Bone and The Hate You Give, which are two very separate genres.
Hate You Give was 2017.
Oh my god.
What is time?
January 2017.
What?
But, like, I don't think either of those like transcended YA like Harry Potter, Twilight, and Hunger Games did.
Yeah. Like I feel like Children of Blood and Bone was supposed to be that book, but I don't think it was.
No. Yeah, they definitely.
I think it was really close.
Yeah, outside of like YA Twitter, I didn't really know anybody who was talking about it.
I mean, Jimmy Fallon made it his book of the summer. It had billboards in California.
New York. I'm not saying it wasn't popular, but I don't think it was like that huge. Like,
well, now that it's been out, now that it's been out for a year, like no one cares about it anymore.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't as big as like the Hunger Games, but I did have like friends here in Georgia who were like, "Hey, have you read this book?" And I was like, "Have I read that book? I know that author." That was like my great opportunity to name drop and act like I was more important than I was to my friend. Yeah, we were in the same writing competition. I'm successful, not. There was something I was going to say. Oh, regarding trying to predict trends. Susan Dennard has talked about this a lot. And I highly recommend looking at her blog if you guys haven't. She talks about her first series that sold, not Truth Witch, was Something Strange and Deadly. And it was a trilogy, and publishers thought that steampunk was going to be the next big thing. So they paid her a lot of money for it. And then it ended up not being the next big thing. And it was like difficult to sell the next book as a result. And it's just really fascinating. So definitely check it out if you haven't.
Yeah, well, that's kind of another I think of like you can't predict what's going to be popular. You can't predict the genre that everyone's reading, or like like All the Boys I Loved Before. That was out, like a long time ago, and now suddenly everybody's into it. So you never know that maybe.
Oh yeah.
And if you write your book now, like it sells and like no one buys it, maybe in 10 years or in next year or in a couple months, like maybe then it will be super popular. Once if you write a vampire novel, and next year when vampire novels come into fashion, then it'll be really big. You never know.
Yeah, because I was gonna say like a movie always helps, but that's not always the case. Like a lot of YA movies just flop. And, a Netflix series I think probably always helps. Yeah. Maybe it's not gonna make you like an international megastar, but it always helps.
Yeah, and that's why I feel like you can't write to trends, but you can write very well to genre. And so like if you like a genre, write a really good book in that genre, and maybe that'll be the next thing, and maybe it won't, and you'll have to wait a little bit, but it's gonna be a big thing eventually.
The flip side in self-publishing is that like you can write to that trend and you can write whatever is selling right now, but it's a lot faster that things get flooded. Like right now, it's reverse harem is the big thing in the self-publishing, specifically romance world. But now there's so many. It's basically like, and they're across multiple genres, but it's a series with a bunch of different love interests, but she doesn't have to pick one. She ends up with all the guys. That is what it is.
All right. I was not expecting.
Huge.
Okay.
It is huge.
Interesting. Because you said reverse, and I'm like,
because harems are, I guess, I don't even know if it was ever like a book trend. I guess it was. The guy getting all the women. But this is
creepy.
Specifically, the woman gets a bunch of guys.
Interesting.
And they all love her, and they're all fine with being with her and everybody else.
You go,
So
girl.
it's
And like sometimes there's like sci-fi reasons of why it has to happen, but I've
Alright.
seen covers for contemporary ones. I don't know. I don't think I've read any of them, but
Interesting.
it was the huge. It was selling so well. A ton of people wrote them, and for the first little while, those sold well as well. And then eventually, the market just kind of floods, and
Mhm.
it's harder to be spotted. So
Mhm.
now you know. Reverse harem.
Interesting. Okay.
I really want to check out that subgenre now. Like,
Right.
I want to read like all the books like
I'm
that.
so
like,
curious. What are the tropes?
I want to know.
Well, at first when you said reverse, I was like, okay, so it's like instead of a guy having a bunch of girls like do whatever, it's just going to be this woman who has like a bunch of hot guys around her all the time. But then ending up with all of them was the twist I was not expecting.
Yeah, like I saw a post on some Facebook group recently if someone tried to write it, but then at the end of the series, she ended up with one of the love interests, and her readers were not happy because that is not what they were signing up for.
Interesting.
Huh.
Huh. Well, I mean, if you're a girl protagonist in a YA novel, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're going to have at least 2 or 3 love interests anyways. So
Yeah. So
everyone
it's
falls in
basically
love with
writing
you.
to that, like, why do I have to choose? Bella's going to get Edward and Jacob. Everybody's happy.
That would have been the most interesting
mean,
thing since my
right?
answer.
Girl,
I
you
feel
get
like
it.
they both
You
would've done
get
it
it.
It would have been significantly better than Jacob falls in love with your fetus.
And that's why he was obsessed with you all this
Agreed.
time.
Oh man. I like that ending.
Let me know.
Yeah.
All right, just got a few minutes left. Is there anything on the broader topic of genre we want to get into? Eventually, we'll go through and like break down more specific genres. If anyone who's watching has any suggestions for genres you'd like us to talk about, let us know in the discussion section, and we'll kind of plan out the rest of our year. But it's such a broad topic that like controls all parts of writing. Like it's everywhere, but it's
Yeah, that was going to be my thing that I asked was like, for people who are like, why are you guys talking about this? Like, why it's important. But that's just it. Like, it's everywhere. It's how you market your book. It's like how you write books.
Mhm.
I mean, like,
and I just think a lot of it will come down to what we said earlier of like reading within that genre and appreciating the tone and the tropes and all of that. But it's also just fun to talk about genres that we love. So that's what we're going to do.
What's the first one? Is it paranormal?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Although in my head, I'm going, it's paranormal and urban fantasy. Like it's
Mhm.
for me, those are two different things. But I think when we discussed it, we were kind of speaking.
Yeah.
broadly.
Okay, cool.
for sure.
Yes, I
So
don't
brush
read a
up
lot of,
on
like,
that.
super romantic stuff. All right, I guess we will end here. Thank you all so much for watching. We will be back next week with something. I don't remember what it was.
I don't have my planner.
You know what? It's going to be something. I'm sure it'll be thrilling.
Yep.
And as always, we will have our weekly videos Monday through Saturday and be back next week. So hopefully we will see you all next time and have a great night. Bye.
Bye.